Martinez. It was said that the oldest among them held the secret to immortality, and that it was the secret that kept the land from drying, form crumbling under the weather of a world that had lost its way along its own axis.
There will be life.
Go. He had come here looking for a bucolic view of the countryside and warm afternoons on the beach notions of paradise. After 2 weeks of getting wasted on various alcoholic drinks in his apartment, but by then, Richard had already realized how screwed up he was, so he thought.
What the hell? Things can only get better here on.
And here he was. He would try to shape words to describe what he was feeling, for he was supposed to be a trained speaker perfectly at home with vowels and bilabials, but at the moment, only expletives pronounced themselves in his mouth.
The sun's messing with my eyes!
He swore, kneading his face, and there isn't anything in the trees at all.
Ano ga? Insan? Are you okay? Alright?
There was nothing like Totoy's English to push anyone over the edge. Richard knew that his own Tagalog wasn't to die for, but Totoy speaking like this was no way to treat a cousin from Manila. He could not quite tell Totoy that, no, he was not all right, which was why he was here in the first place. Richard should have been facilitating corporate seminars in Makati, but 2 weeks ago, his boss had showed him a pile of evaluation sheets that revealed, in no uncertain terms, that Richard was a lousy motivational speaker. He wouldn't have minded so much if it had been the first time he'd been told that, but it had been the fifth time and the fifth company, and Richard was only 25. So much for a career. He had believed he was on the road to success, and now he was literally in the middle of nowhere. Richard ran his hands through his hair, feeling for lumps, evidence of the 7 million times he'd banged his skull against the jeep's steel frame. He wondered if a concussion was making him see those black things flitting in the trees. They were little more than shadows, but every time he tried to focus on them, they disappeared.
Optical fatigue.
He told himself, and that isn't the fluttering of...
Oh, for Christ's sakes!
Thorns made little screeching sounds against the jeep's fender. Unfazed, Totoy jerked the jeep back on track, his hair flapping, his lips curled in a grin that showed off his crooked teeth. Richard tried to recall just how depressed he'd been right before Totoy texted to ask if he might like a vacation. Now, Richard was wondering if maybe suicide in his apartment had been the better option.
Where are we going again?
Sa Martinez, didn't I say?
Richard stared at his cousin for a minute, waiting, and when Totoy began to whistle, a ditty that sounded like some terminally ill animal, Richard stifled a sigh and looked out at the road instead. At lunch, Totoy had asked him to come not on a trip to the beach or to the fields, but on an errand. To deliver a gift, Totoy had added. Richard had been about to refuse when his aunt and uncle left the table, and Richard made out of the name despite their lowered voices, Martinez.
Who Martinez was?
Martinez would change your life forever.
It sounded like a good thing a couple of hours ago. Now, as the sun glowered through the trees and burned his skin, Richard brooded over what Totoy had actually said.
That's you? What you call it? Destiny?
Destiny?
You know, Insan, as in, it was Destiny's game when you finally came along, only to find.
To think that Totoy had just passed the board exams to become an engineer. It bewildered Richard that his cousin had been going around smiling stupidly at him, bright eyes winking from under that shaggy hair. They were just the same age, with Richard only a few months older, but that was the one thing they had in common. Richard had not visited the province in years, not since high school, when his father died of a stroke and his mother went off earn liras in Italy. He had loved his dad as any son would, and yet he had not been very affected by his death. What shocked Richard about the whole thing was not the stroke itself, but the fact that something unexpected had happened to his father at all. The man had probably never felt anything so exciting. Richard had never understood his father's placid disposition, his contentment with the barest of lifestyles, his devotion to the office he'd worked in for an eternity duty, his dad had said.
There were things that needed to be done, or how anybody could stay rooted to the same place they had lived in all their lives, like the Cervasio clan.
They were the oldest family in the village, and Richard had heard tell that the rice fields would perish without them, and yet it was not as if they were earning more than the other farmers. All their neighbors had houses 5 times larger than Totoy's, for example. Richard had aimed to reach for the top all his life, and he could not understand these people whose only ambition, it seemed to him, was to reach 100 years old and die on the same land where their child had formed his first crook tooth. At least, the neighbors had sense enough to send someone from their households abroad to greener pastures that delivered prosperity.
Where was this Martinez?
He squinted into the woods, those shadows again. He had always hated the country, the humidity, the gigantic flies, the stench of animal dung that never seemed to go away. But that story about a stranger and the stones as red as blood. There were no flocks of birds in the sky and no red rocks among the shrubs. Richard shook off the feeling. He was lost, after all, in his father's old town, and there was nothing else to do but endure his cousin's tuneless whistling and the shrieks of plants that clawed at him from the sides of the jeep. In Richard's head, while the ride in the jeep fell into a rhythm and the sunlight engulfed his face in a dizzying warmth, a story from long ago began to play out as a dream.
Once there was a stranger who walked through a village.
These days, nobody knows how this stranger looked like. Not the height, the build, not even the gender. Only the voice lingers in the memory, a voice that whispered like bamboo leaves, sweet as a woman's. It is said that she came from the mountains, and with her coming, the earth began to unfurl with her every step. The land on which the village lay sprawled was mainly rock and sand, and the only trees that would survive were coconut. But when the stranger came, she turned the earth till it was loam, so that vegetables and flowers could blossom. She caused crops to grow, trees to yield fruits, fish and livestock to be bountiful. She dug out the sweetest of waters and conjured mind seasons, filling the hearts of the villagers with a quiet desire to work and dream. It is said that seedlings bloomed like miracles on the places where she walked. And so they asked the stranger to stay. She could not, of course, for she had other villages to visit, but still they pleaded. Stay.
I could not.
Stay. Then and only then did she suggest the contract. It is wise to suspect a contract, but it may be wiser to suspect one's ability to keep one's part of the terms. The head of the village, thus confident, asked for the nature of the agreement, and here was the stranger's condition.
Remember.
Remember?
Remember, and your village will continue to flourish.
But what if we forget? For our memories die sooner than our bodies.
Then tell your offspring, and this way nothing can die.
But what if they forget? For our offspring inherit all our frailties.
Then shall be reminded.
And lo, A cloud overhead stretched across the village, and the people looked up to see the shape shatter into 1,000 birds, small and black like the shadows of memories, and they flew down to the edge of the village where grew a young acacia tree. The villagers exclaimed at the miracle, but when they turned back to the stranger, praises on their mouths, they saw only dents in the earth where she had stood. Richard jolted awake. Totoy had just parked the jeep. He pulled out a length of steel bar, an empty jute sock, and a coil of rope from under his seat, then hopped out towards the undergrowth.
No, Insan, you stay there. You don't have to come.
The hell I don't! What are you gonna do with all that?
Totoy handed him the steel bar. It looked like it had been an old part of the jeep, and the weight surprised him. His cousin shoved the sack into his own back pocket and deftly tied a few intricate knots as they walked into the thicket.
It's for Kwan, pangbitag,
What in the world are you gonna set up a trap for?
for offering.
Said his cousin, leading him down a slope and into a clearing where the sound of rushing water seemed to wash out Totoy's faulty enunciation.
For Martinez.
A shallow brook bubbled over the stone in the clearing. From above, the leaves shimmered in the sun and cast mottled shadows on the water. On the ground blossomed dozens of patches of tiny flowers. Richard leaned on the steel bar and pronounced Pichusque, while Totoy strolled along the brook towards a small grotto. The grotto slanted into the ground through a small entrance, but Totoy easily slipped in a few knots of the rope and then hid the rest under the bushes, where he set up a few more knots involving the stems of young trees and pieces of rock.
Is this what they teach engineers now?
Richard said, peering over his cousin's shoulder. Totoy had that sun-brown smell of peasant folk that Richard associated with unsanitary circumstances, and he backed up.
Are you joking, Insan? I have been catching animals since I learned how to walk.
You must have had a boring childhood.
They settled down to wait among the bushes a few meters away. Totoy gave him his silly grin.
No, Insan, it's you who missed out on many things. You will learn from Martinez.
Martinez. I won't even ask this time.
So instead he asked.
What are we trying to catch there?
Totoy began munching one end of a twig like he would a tooth.
Martinez likes lizards. You want like this?
I'm fine, thank you.
Inang and Ditang told me before that long ago, Martinez also liked musang.
Alright,
A minute later, when Richard could no longer stand not talking, he said,
what's a masang?
Plenty of things you don't know. Small wild cats with dog faces. Long ago, our grandfathers would catch musang and offer carcass to Martinez. But now no more. No more musang in this forest, only lizard.
I'm in a zoo?
Gazing down at the steel bar in his hand, I've worked as language coach for 2 call centers and speech trainer for 3 corporations.
What in the world am I doing out here?
I really don't know.
His boss had said, a nice enough executive, but Richard's records and hundreds of evaluation sheets about him gave the old man no choice. Judge and found one thing. Richard looked to the heavens. The sunlight blinded him, but not before he saw a small black bird, its streaked wings flapping a short distance above his head.
Did you see it?
His cousin's eyes seemed lidless underneath his hair.
What, Insan?
A bird, a crest on its head like a crown. I swear it was going to swoop.
You know, Insan, you returned just in time.
That hadn't be a bird, just a sun in my eye.
Insan, did you know that you're the oldest of our generation? Tata Onsing is dying, and now you're here.
What the hell are you talking about?
Tata Onsing is the oldest brother of Tata Doming.
Who the hell is Tata Doming?
Insan, Tata Doming is our, great-grandpa, lolo sa tuhod.
Sure, I remember now. Are you telling me you didn't see the black bird?
Totoy snatched the twig from his mouth and waved it at him for silence. Richard grimaced at the stray drops of spittle, and then he heard bushes shaking and the sound of something thrashing in the dampness of the grotto. Totoy on the twig and crept through the thicket, running his fingers along the rope that he had knotted around the shrubs, to the opening of the grotto.
The man might have been a reptile himself.
In one swift moment, Totoy clenched his fists around the rope, swung his arms, bolted down, and then straightened up, jerking the rope with his full strength. Richard heard the thwapping of the knots closing in on the catch, and suddenly he was staring at the lizard dangling in front of his face. Richard tightened his grip on the steel bar. He had seen pictures of monitor lizards in encyclopedias before, and twice or thrice of the real things in the zoo, but they had all seemed to Richard still as stone. But this lizard, despite having been bound at the jaws, limbs and tail by Totoy's systems of knots, was as civilized as only a rabid wildcat could get. It could have been a meter long from snout to tail, a lean, mean, writhing reptile.
Huli!
Richard did as he was told. He poised with the steel bar as Totoy pulled the thrashing lizard up towards him.
Shouldn't we kill it now? It's putting up a fight.
Martinez will do it.
Totoy spat out the twig and drove it into the ground with his heel.
Don't worry. Enough time and it will know it is caught.
Turning me into a pansy, muttered Richard as he gathered a bunch of the white and yellow flowers from the side of the brook. Totoy then hoisted the sack over his shoulder, and the thing did not stop bouncing and thrashing about, even as it was tossed onto the floor of the jeep. And Richard kicked the steel bar against it, and Totoy revved up the engine, and the jeep started to dodder up the dirt road again. Only when the jeep had gone past the tangles of shrubbery into the coconut jungles did Richard notice that the sack had finally stopped moving.
He should have just stayed home with the alcohol.
He held on to the flowers the rest of the way, even as the movement of the jeep rocked him back to sleep and to the story in his dream. And so the sun and the storms took turns in their assault, but the waters remained sweet and the land was always green and golden in the seasons of ripeness. And whenever the little birds rose like flowers from the acacia, the villagers knew in their hearts what they had been given. The leader of the village kept all these things until his death. When he died, the villagers turned to the youngest members of his family.
You are young and can remember well. Which of you will remember in your ancestor, please?
I will, for I know more about the world than anyone else.
This is how things have been since then. Many other strangers came as generations passed. Visitors who wielded gold and fire and books. Pale men in odd clothing who tried to change the village with their own gifts. And the land thrived despite the false gifts, and the people lived in much abundance, until the day came when the last villager who remembered was lain down in the earth from whence he came. The village found none to replace him, for the youngest of the clan were mere babes, and there was no one else who would take up the burden. The little blackbirds shooted the sky, but still the villagers began to forget. And then the disaster fell upon them. And for many nights, the sounds of grief were so deep that the soil's heart broken in a flood of despair, grief so strong that the waters colored the rocks with blood, grief so sharp that it shook the mountains and ripped apart the heavens. And this was when the stranger returned, and where she walked, the seeds of the earth broke and blossomed. She called to one of the birds that nested in the acacia.
A final grief.
One hand held the bird's crested head so that it opened its beak. The other glimmered with the silver of a knife. With fingers so delicate that the very air around them seemed to dance, the stranger pulled out the bird's tang.
This is how you will be reminded.
You know, Insan, there is no such thing as miracles. No coincidence either. Reap what you sow, as they say.
Richard rubbed his eyes, cursing under his breath. Couldn't Totoy see that he'd fallen asleep? There had been something hovering in his dream, the air of a nightmare.
Why did you agree to come home, Insan?
He wanted to say, I'm not home, you moron, I'm only visiting. But the unsettling feeling had welled up in his throat. He glanced around. In these parts, there were no more huts and shrubs, just palm trees that towered above them like gods, and in the west, the dark foliage of faraway woods. He had a vision again of crested birds with white streaks on their wings, of red rocks strewn across the land, but he pushed it all away. By now, the sun hovered above the woods, the deep glow of its light breaking into solid shape.
Insan? Quarter life crisis! What's that, Insan?
It means I'm doubting my profession.
Then you are lost.
Something like that. But I guess hotshot engineers wouldn't know anything about getting lost.
I'm engineer only, so I can take care of Inang and Ditang.
My mother can't come home yet. She's earning so much there.
Tio Rudy love his home.
I know. Doesn't mean I have to though.
There flitted across his cousin's face a little smile that Richard would remember in the years to come. The jeep wove on under the palm trees. A peculiar coconut tree rose into view, all trunk and withered leaves as brown as the earth. The jeep slowed down to a stop beside the dead tree. Totoy turned to Richard.
You don't know anything.
Richard sat there, blinking as Totoy took the flowers from him. With his free hand, Totoy dragged the jute sack and the steel bar out of the jeep. He walked around to Richard's side. The sack slung motionless over one shoulder and waited. Past this red rock? There it was at the roots of the dried tree. Solid rock, misshapen, misplaced, and where the sunlight struck, the red grain sparkled eerily. Richard placed one hand on the rock and felt heat in its coarseness. He glanced up at the dead palm tree and thought he saw the light of the sun set the wilted fronds aflame. If he could only remember where they had driven from, he would jump back into the jeep. He shook himself and hurried after his cousin. It is said that the stranger left the blackbird to the care of the villagers. These days, however, nobody will say where the creature was kept or what became of it as the seasons came and went. What may be said is that the stranger wept as she departed, and while her tears washed away some of the sorrows of the land, her very words unfurled the earth.
If the contract is broken once again,
Her voice the rustle of leaves in the trees.
I will visit a third time to drain the land after your demise.
Trees took root where she walked, and they are all that remains of our voice. And so the pain is born, because it is a language unto itself. Thus the bird learned and grew and spoke. The coconut trees seemed to gaze down at the two men, looming over them from the height of the sky. He and Totoy walked in silence until Richard could no longer see where they had parked the jeep.
Shouldn't we have brought a flashlight or something? The sun's about to set, and it'll be completely dark when we get back.
You see that tall acacia? That the hat of Martinez beside it?
Richard looked straight ahead, and sure enough, there stood the one tree 4 miles around that was not coconut. Dwarfed by its slender neighbors, the acacia seemed to make up for its lack of height with thick branches, reaching out with dark, impenetrable leaves, and right in the tree's shadow was the nipa shack.
Near enough.
They would drop off Totoy's gift and get the hell out of there. There would be no need to talk about destinies. He would say he would deal with his problems alone, because it was his life and no one's else. Rome and other such spirits waited for him back home. He thought of the days in Makati, of the buildings that sparkled with offers and rejections. He thought of his mother's letters, the echo of loneliness from beneath her words. But then, Richard glanced at Totoy whistling what unearthly tune. Flowers in his hand and a monster lizard in the sack slung over his shoulder, and he vowed he would never return to this country again. As they walked on, Richard saw that there was a clearing in front of the hut. Despite the twilight's hue, he saw the rest red rock similar to the one that had marked the side of the road, littered across the ground But as the cousins approached the cleaning, Richard realized that the rocks were not randomly strewn from some long forgotten landslide. There were dozens of the small boulders arranged across the clearing in clean, spacious rows.
You was superstitious.
Me? Superstitious?
Sometimes the coconut farmers say, at night they hear the crying of infants and children from the rocks.
That's messed up, man.
You don't know about them? Tio Rudy told you nothing?
And that was when Richard could not pretend about the memory anymore. A family history, a tale of blackbirds and red rocks, a sacrifice that granted speech. His gaze swung back to the acacia, and he saw hundreds of the birds perched among the branches, nesting in holes they had carved in the tree trunk. They held Richard's gaze with their bright yellow eyes.
The Martinez, like the Musang, they are now rarely seen here. Related to myna birds, only the Martinez have crests on their head and white streaks on their wings. When Martinez are young, people can teach them to speak by snipping their tongues bit by bit.
Hundreds of black birds in the tree. Yellow eyes, a gust of wind from their wings.
You were saying, Insan, that you were lost? Not anymore. The oldest of the youngest must take up the burden. Memory is a fragile thing.
Coincidence.
Totoy said nothing. He stepped forward.
There was probably a war or an epidemic. Lots of people used to die in wars and epidemics. Coincidence.
Destiny, we come to Martinez.
Richard wheeled around to run, but there was a flash of steel hit him hard on the back of his head. The last thing that he saw before he blacked out were the flowers that Totoy was laying among the rows of rust-red stones. In the darkness, Richard smelled the acid odor of decaying wood or bird droppings of a dying reptile. He heard the sound of tearing. He clenched his fist in alarm, but his hands were tied behind his back, and his feet, too, were bound with rope. He was sprawled on the floor, and as he struggled to sit up, the sound took on another form. A chewing, a gobbling, a flapping of wings. Richard cried out.
Insan.
Light! Turn on the blasted light!
Are you sure, Insan?
A light, please.
Richard heard a match strike, and a faint light crawled into his vision. He saw Totoy standing by a door, a candle in his hand. Its flame enshrouded the tiny shack with a shingle, wreathing shadow. Near the door was an ancient table cluttered with books and sheaves of paper.
Insan, Tatay Onsing.
Weakly, Tata Onsing lifted one guard hand, and with another whimper, the old man let his hand drop on a sheet of paper. A pen scratched with difficulty.
Told to him and to him only. After him, you. If I had been born before you, Insan, I would have gladly accepted this burden. But I am a only builder of things.
Richard shifted his gaze to the shadows, and the first thing he saw were the mangled remains of a lizard strewn on the dirt floor. Bayawak, he remembered irrelevantly. That's what it's called. Then he saw bright yellow eyes the size of bottle caps, a slimy beak, midnight wings streaked with white. The great bird hopped over the reptile's corpse. It hopped close to Richard's feet, cocking its crested head. When it hopped onto his knees, digging its claws into the tender muscles of his flesh. Richard tried his best not to cry out. He failed, and when his mouth opened, the great bird struck. In the haze that took over his mind, Richard watched his cousin lift the candle on the table, seek Tata Onsing's feeble hand for a blessing, and creep out back to his owner-type jeep, past the rust-red rock and the coconut jungle. Richard wondered about Totoy and Tata Onsing and his mother in Italy, and his father long gone, and the Bayawak and Musang and the Martinez perched in the acacia. The Martinez bent its crested head to his ear and started to peek.